Being And in doing so, being able to not only figure out what it means for us as a foundation, but how do we actually ensure that we're sharing our learning so that the overall field of philanthropy can continue to grow and evolve. During this webinar, you'll have an opportunity to learn about what our grant making looked like over the past year. Once again, being able to surface some of the big questions on our mind as we think about how we move through investment or how we move through spend out. So thinking through our investment strategy, thinking through our capacity building program. And we want to be able to discuss the ways that Kataly is continuing to evolve as we make our way towards spend out. To really put this conversation in our current context, we wanted to really highlight some of the political questions that we sit with thinking about our role as a Spend Out Foundation. So some of the questions that keep me up at night, not too late, but just a little bit, are what is the role of private family foundations in this political moment? How do we make the highest and best use of our resources? What is our responsibility to our social movements? How do we continue to figure out how to move in just and right relationship? And as a spend out, how do we manage the expectations that others have of us, our commitment to our grantees, while also being able to make the necessary strategic decisions to help us achieve our mission? And through all of it, how are we accountable, not just through our words, but also through our actions as a foundation? And so these are some of the topics we hope to be able to surface with all of you, and want to just note that this is not an attempt to say that we have it all figured out. This is really an opportunity to invite you all into our best thinking and really lift up how Kataly is just one of many experiments that are really wrestling with these questions in terms of how can philanthropy really support social movements and those that are trying to create systemic change. And so it's a pleasure to introduce my colleague, Danielle Royston Lopez, our Grants and Program Associate. Danielle will take a moment to really take us through what our 2022 grant making looked like in the past year.
Thank you so much, Anaka, and greetings, everyone. It is a pleasure to be with you all today. As introduced, I am Danielle Royston Lopez, Grants and Programs Associate here at the Kataly Foundation, and really excited to share with you a couple of slides that will show what the Kataly Foundation has been able to accomplish, mostly focusing on 2022. And just to reiterate as well, with what Amaka had mentioned, part of the purpose of this webinar is to engage in a practice of transparency around our grant making. So we're going to focus on 2022. But before I get into that, I do also want to note a couple of resources. In 2021, Kataly hosted a series of webinars on our 3 program areas, the environmental Justice Resourcing Collective, Mindfulness and Healing Justice program, as well as the Restorative Economies Fund. And if you're interested in learning more about the funding priorities, strategies, and principles of Kataly's programs, these webinars are an excellent resource of information. Iris is dropping links in the chat to those recordings and the blog post roundups of those webinars as well. And I'm just going to give us a quick moment to bring up a few slides to talk about our giving. Thanks so much. So to begin, we want to start back at the beginning and look at our total giving. Kataly was created with an initial investment of $445 million in assets from Regan Pritzker and Chris Holland in 2018. To date, we have redistributed $110 million of this investment, with an additional $87 million pledged for the years to come. To break this down further, we can look at the resources given and pledged by program area. So for our 3 core program areas, the Environmental Justice Resourcing Collective has committed 50% of its funds. Mindfulness and Healing Justice is at 51%, and the Restorative Economies Fund is at 40%. In addition, 25% of funds redistributed have been rapid response funds, and 8% has gone towards capacity building. You'll notice that capacity building has a relatively small percentage thus far. This is because our capacity building program began grant making in 2022. So this percentage will increase over the next few years. Next, I'd like to speak on rapid response grant making. And the Foundation's approach to rapid response grant making has continued to evolve over the time that Kataly has been around. In 2022, we redistributed $1.8 million in response to the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court decision, as well as the climate disasters in Alaska and Puerto Rico. Rather than pivoting to new issue areas when there is emerging crises or waiting to see how others respond, our approach to rapid response has been to recommit support to our grantee partners, as well as organizations that are building and strengthening communities and really holding that space of solidarity during emerging crises. Iris is also dropping a few links in the chat to some of our rapid response grant announcements if you want to learn more specifically about who we've supported with rapid response funds. And I would also like to highlight the number of Kataly grantees. So currently, Kataly has 151 active grantees, which refers to grantee partners who are continuing to receive grant and investment support from the Foundation. You can also learn more about our grantee partners from our grantee directory on our website, which lists all of our past and present grantee partners, the funding they've received from us, the timeline for those grant awards, and more. And next, I would like to talk about an ongoing grant making initiative that's happening right now in the Fortification Awards. So for Fortification Awards, one of our commitments as a foundation is to be open to experimentation, adaptation, especially as conditions are changing in the world around us. And we know the last few years, conditions tend to change pretty rapidly. One of the ways that we've evolved our support for grantee partners recently was through Fortification Awards that we're distributing right now in early 2023. So this is really in response to the experience that we've had collectively of persistent challenging economic conditions in the last year. And we know that social movements have been impacted by this economic reality in the most acute ways. So this month, we are awarding $6.85 million to 137 grantee partners via one-time grants of unrestricted support. Our hope is that these supplementary grants offer some relief to organizations that are contending with the uncertain economic conditions of this time. Grantees receiving these Fortification Awards are active multi-year grantees of the Foundation, as well as new or renewed grantee partners who've received a grant before June of 2022. And so now we can talk a little bit about how we support our grantees. So in 2022, the ratio of one-time to multi-year grant awards was 81% of multi-year awards, 19% one-time awards. The chart next to this breaks down the different types of grant support that we offer to our grantee partners. So you'll see in 2022, 68% of our grant making was general operating support, and 32% was special initiatives, which we define as rapid response, capital campaign support, as well as some project-specific support. And I will share a little bit more about capital campaign support shortly. But before I do, I would like to speak on land-based projects. This is an area of focus that is a real through line through all of Kataly's programs. So land-based projects. As a Spend Out Foundation, we want to make sure that communities own the assets that they have and can continue to regenerate wealth and benefit long into the future. Across our 3 program areas at Kataly, we have observed that grantees are participating in a myriad of land-based projects. Land is being taken out of the speculative market and preserved for public good, like access to reliable and affordable housing. Land is being stewarded to implement climate justice strategies that include food sovereignty campaigns or permaculture campaigns. Land is being stewarded as a site for communities to have safe and sacred spaces to gather for collective healing strategies, ceremony, preservation of cultural practices, and land is being respected as a community wealth building asset, not to have value extracted from, but to be stewarded for the benefit of all people. Kataly has had the honor of supporting 67 land-based projects in 2022. And part of how we do this is through capital campaign contributions. In speaking specifically to capital campaign contributions, I do want to draw a few distinctions about the types of capital campaign support we provide. First, there's pre-development funding, which is similar to a planning grant. So when an organization is planning to launch a capital campaign or doing the preliminary research necessary to determine debt or how much money can be raised, we can come in with pre-development funding for that. And then there's capital campaign funding, which can be funds to redevelop and or operate a property. In 2022, Kataly redistributed $1.4 million in pre-development funding and 22.9 million in capital campaign funding. And so this is just a brief snapshot of the work that has been done in 2022. And it is my pleasure to hand it over to my colleague, Jocelyn Wong, who is the Director of Capacity Building and Analyst for the Restorative Economies Fund, to tell us more about the capacity building program at Kataly. Jocelyn, welcome.
Hi, everybody. So thank you so much, Danielle. It's great to be with you all. My name is Jocelyn Wong, and I serve as Kataly's Director of Capacity Building and as an analyst with our Restorative Economies Fund. And a quick housekeeping note, I can't seem to turn on my video, so I'm putting that out to my team in hopes that that can be troubleshooted while I begin my presentation. Oh, there we are. Hey, everyone. And it's so cool to hear Danielle talk about our land-based work. As a former capital campaign director, it just fills me with a lot of gratitude and pride to hear the stats on that work. So thank you all. I know many of you are on the call today who are doing incredible work on the land and testing out some unconventional campaign strategies as it relates to your fundraising in that realm. So at its core, Kataly is a radical experiment in wealth redistribution. And what we know to be true and what we have heard reflected back to us by our grantees is that building community wealth and power is actually so much more than just a matter of financial transactions. Rather, this kind of transformation involves non-financial shifts, including cultivating new networks and relationships, having time and space to connect with and learn among peers, and building new skills and expertise. So from the start, we had a pretty strong hypothesis that some form of capacity building or non-financial assistance for grantees would emerge as an element of our work. But it was also not a foregone conclusion. We started with a process of research and deep listening to better understand the landscape of capacity building support and where there were outstanding gaps and needs across the various movement ecosystems that Kataly touches. I met with our program leads, our environmental justice, resource and collective leaders, and interviewed or sat in on conversations with a cross-section of movement leaders, peer funders, and TA providers. Thank you to those of you who are on the call who were part of that early landscape scan. Next slide, please. So from that discovery process, a couple of things. First, it was pretty immediately clear that there was no need for us to create an internally held capacity building program, particularly as a spend-out foundation. There are already incredible capacity building organizations, practitioners, coaches, trainers who are aligned with and also actively supporting the important work of our grantees and borrowers. So if anything, Kataly could play a meaningful role by directly supporting and increasing access to capacity building resources where they already exist. Related to that point, we also heard from many folks that there is a need to support BIPOC practitioners in building the bench in high demand areas such as conflict transformation and resource mobilization. For example, if a group is looking for a values aligned capital campaign consultant, for example, with both professional and lived experience, the referral list is painfully short. And there's not an organized body of practitioners who have the capacity to mentor and deepen this bench. So that's an area that we're looking at. In addition, some of our grantees and borrowers themselves hold the expertise that others are seeking out, but seldom have the space, time, connection, resources to one another to exchange tools and knowledge. We heard a strong desire, nonetheless, for peer learning and connection in ways that address specific and even niche challenges. Folks need space to train up and learn from each other as the landscape changes for this work, whether that's about creating new formations to steward land or other resources, or building new models of shared leadership and collective governance. Next slide, please. So ultimately, we developed this vision statement to guide our capacity building work, focused on fostering resilient change agents, highly collaborative teams and partnerships, and enduring community assets. Social movements are fundamentally about transformation and change, and yet the individuals and organizations that make up social movements are not always very well equipped to navigate change and adapt to new conditions. To actually be changed by the work in a way that makes us stronger and more resilient. I can say that from personal experience, just being in the work, and so ultimately the opportunity to focus on our ability to adapt and change is a central goal of ours. It's our hope that when it comes time for Kataly to sunset, that we have contributed to increase our movement partners' ability to embrace and manage change, as well as their capacity for adaptation. Next slide, please. So taking an emergent approach to rolling out various capacity building partnerships and offerings, we've had a few aha moments over the past year. First, and this seems painfully obvious in retrospect, incorporating capacity building offerings, especially those that are more substantive in nature, such as the cohort-based boot camp we ran in partnership with Raise for Good, actually requires time and spaciousness to begin with. Carving out that time can be prohibitive for a group that is just starting out with few staff or even volunteer run. Related, we are experimenting with breadth versus depth. Some offerings are designed with a low lift entry point, while others are designed to dig deeper. For example, we've partnered with People's Hub to enroll grantees in workshop series covering disability justice and navigating conflict. Both workshop series provide a really excellent introduction to these topics, but our partnership with People's Hub doesn't yet provide for accompaniment and coaching after folks bring content back to their respective organizations. On the flip side, the Race for Good boot camp I mentioned earlier required a significant commitment of time and attention, but also yielded deep peer connections within the cohort and coaching to integrate learning and practice. Finally, a reflection, a learning is that there are advantages and disadvantages to partnering with more traditional capacity building organizations that offer trainings and workshops with broad nonprofit appeal. And the same is true of partnering with groups and organizations that are interested in co-designing new content that is perhaps more tailored to or responsive to the specific needs of Kataly's grantees. For example, we are partnering with Purpose Possible to design and roll out a suite of capacity building offerings to support folks who are running capital campaigns. Many of the quote unquote best practices of capital campaigns are dated and not in keeping with our values of centering and building power in BIPOC communities. So we are essentially creating a curriculum from scratch and designing spaces for peer learning and resource sharing. This is incredibly important work, and it is also incredibly time and resource intensive. So all of these things are kind of dynamics and questions that we're just experimenting with and wrestling in the work. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share, and I'll be passing it along to my colleague Lynn to discuss our investment strategy.
Thanks, Jocelyn. I just want to take a moment to really celebrate Jocelyn, who's an absolute superstar. We get consistent feedback from our grantees and investees on how impactful the capacity building program is. And I'm really glad you all got to hear a little bit that they shared about the work with you today. So I'm Lynn Hoy. I'm the Chief Investment Officer of the Kataly Foundation, and I am going to take you through our investment strategy. Now, when we're talking about our investment strategy, we will be specifically referring to the investment strategy of our unrestricted reserves, which some people might know better as an endowment. And so we'll walk through a little bit about the goals of the investment strategy, how it's transformed over time, what's changed in 2022, and some of the big questions we're grappling with. So let's now look at the next slide as to the goals of the strategy. So the goals of Kataly's investment strategy is that we want to do as much as we can within a limited time period that we have, leading with mission first. So one thing I would name is, I think a lot of us experienced a scarcity mentality as a spend out foundation as to what we could do with the time period we have, which is roughly 10 to 15 years. And actually, there's a ton of freedom in being a spend out strategy when you're thinking about how to invest your unrestricted reserve. So we really wanted to invest the unrestricted reserve in line with our values first and foremost. That's feedback we've received consistently from our team and feedback we've received consistently from the field. We also have a committed amount that we want to grant and invest over the next 10 plus years. And so we have to preserve the capital that we have within that unrestricted reserve. We also want to take into account that things change. Like, look how much everything has changed in the last 3 years. So to be responsive to the needs of our grantees, we have to keep our funds relatively liquid. We have a fixed time horizon, as I mentioned earlier, that we consider, which allows for focus and direction. And we're trying to be non-extractive. And frankly, the traditional financial system does not make that easy. So the interesting thing for us as a spend out is we consistently spend more than 5% every year and generating a return, which is usually the number one thing people look at with an investment strategy, isn't one of our top priorities. It's really about aligning our values, capital preservation, and liquidity. So we'll look at what the original strategy was and what we're looking at strategically now as we move through how we're going to invest the funds. Over on the next slide. Great. So our original strategy for the endowment was divided by our board and our advisors, and it was a harm reduction strategy, a liquidity strategy, meaning that the funds were available daily for us to grant out or invest out through our restorative economics framework. And also, again, preserving the capital to ensure that we didn't lose money. It was also an indirect strategy, which means that we invested in funds as opposed to directly investing in companies through equity. And it's really interesting because when you invest in a mutual fund, you actually lose your right to vote. So oftentimes when we're thinking about shareholder advocacy strategies, you have to invest directly with the organization. Otherwise, you essentially sign a proxy vote that gives your vote to BlackRock or to State Street or one of these large asset managers. And when we're thinking about how we are in relationship with community, it's really important that we use our power and our privilege to be a voice at the table. So this was really a placeholder strategy. And over the next 18 months or so, the Amaka, Jolene Ruffin, who's our CFO, and I really think about what can an interim strategy look like that was more in line with our values. So we decided we were invested in an equity fund, and we got completely out of that fund in 2022. We felt that equity is extractive, and it's really interesting, right? Because in most foundations, the investment strategy that's within the endowment and the grant making strategy are separate. When the market has a bad year, like we just had, people reduce their grant making. But when the market's up 20%, do people increase it? Not really, because they're thinking about how to be in perpetuity. So for us, like that feels like a very extractive relationship, and we wanted no part in it. So we decided to get out of equities. We wanted to explore more of a fixed income and cash strategy. And that's really, again, back to the capital preservation piece. So what would it look like to invest in community banks through certificates of deposits, or to invest in community development financial institutions through some of their middle to long-term debt strategies? And how do we ensure that we're holding enough cash on hand to be able to do the things that Danielle talked about, like rapid response in response to the repeal of Roe versus Wade, or some of the climate crises that we have to address pretty quickly, and also to do the fortification grants. So we've been really working on our clarity for our total budget for spend out, and also thinking through, with the tools we have available, how do we get beyond ESG? That's environmental social governance funds. And it can be pretty challenging, to be honest. So we're going to just look on, I'll talk a little bit about the challenges, and then we'll move on to the next slide to show the breakdown of the investments by what we call asset class, so equity, fixed income, and cash. So the racial wealth gap has created some major constraints for us in how we invest our funds. For example, Blacks-led community development financial institutions are have six times less capital than many white-led institutions. And therefore, they don't have the capacity to take on large amounts of capital that is often required for investment in an endowment or in an unrestricted reserve. And so we are right now in a state of inquiry around how do we get closer to community with our investment strategy, acknowledging that the racial wealth gap has really constricted our ability to do that. So I'm just going to go over to the next slide, and we can see a little bit about how we've been investing it. So the past strategy, we were about 38% in equities, 36% in fixed income. So you can think of that as in a fund that invests in cash, or in a fund that invests in treasuries, or in a fund that invests in debt. And then we hold about 25% cash on balance sheet. So as I mentioned, right now, we've come completely out of equities, and we're focusing on the fixed income strategy for preserving our capital and our liquidity to be responsive to our grantees and investees. And then we keep about 18% on hand at all times. So again, coming out of the equity fund was really in line with our non-extractive values. And we have spent the last 18 months, 12 to 18 months, becoming aware of the ongoing needs of our program areas within Kataly, particularly around the flexibility in grant making. So again, having a fixed income strategy that's liquid, having more access to cash really helps us manage the ever-changing needs of our program areas and as of our grantees. And we're conscious of interest rates and inflation, that as a fixed cost foundation, it makes sense for us to have more of a cash management strategy as opposed to an investment management strategy. So investing in longer term equities where you're subject to the markets going up and down, receiving those 20% returns and having them taken away in a life cycle. And then we really thinking through in 2022 the opportunities and limitations as to investing the majority of the foundation's funds in certificates of deposit and community development financial institutions. As I mentioned earlier, we really do have to think through how the racial wealth gap shows up, think through the investment advisors that we're working with to help us invest more in line with our values. It's been a little bit of a challenging process, to be honest, but we've been learning a lot as we go. And I mentioned that there's a lot of people probably heard of environmental social governance, ESG funds, but having been to a number of conferences, nobody really knows what the S in ESG stands for. They know it's social, but they don't know what that means. And that's really where justice is. That's where investing with your values with a justice lens and focusing on the S in ESG seems very interesting to us, but we don't even know if there are products available that would allow Kataly to meet its justice investment goals. So I'll go over to the next slide now. And these are the key questions we're sitting with. So is this strategy in service to our grantees and investees? Everything always comes back to community. How can Kataly set an example of what it means to invest in large amounts of money non-extractively? It's interesting because we oftentimes get told if you want to invest and preserve your capital, you should invest in treasuries. And then there's an open question of, do we want to be investing in the US government, considering some of the policies in the US government around the communities that we're serving? So that's a question. Can we lessen the constraints within the financial system for investing in Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities? That's a big question too. Like, what is our role there? And how do we have a hybrid public? So investing in the funds we talked about earlier with a private, so investing in like a community development financial institution, what does that look like over time? And the biggest question we sit with is like, what is good enough for Kataly? We have a limited life, we can only do so much. And so what is good enough for us in terms of what we're leaving as inspiration for the field and how they can invest their endowment more in line with their values? And one of my favorite places to sit with, and a big question we have, is how do we actually move the asset managers, investment advisors, chief investment officers, and CFOs of other foundations beyond ESG? There's a lot of power concentrated with these asset managers in terms of encouraging the companies they invest in to do the right thing. And so how can we move asset managers and investment advisors who hold a lot of the power towards justice? So I'm going to stop there and hand it back to our CEO, Maka Agbo, to take us through our logic model process, which informs how we do our work.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Always great to hear your brilliance as we think about how to manage our assets. So I'm going to take a moment to share with all of you a process that we went through last year. A process really focusing in on developing a logic model for our foundation. Over the past few years, we've had the pleasure of being supported and guided by Syra Pinto of Moon Jaguar Consulting. And as Syra has helped us to really facilitate us through our organizational development work, our culture and building work, one thing that became really clear is that as Kataly was a foundation that launched with 3 individual projects, our Mindfulness and Healing Justice Program, our Environmental Justice Resourcing Collective, and the Restorative Economies Fund, we really needed to figure out how do we come together under the heading of Kataly to really achieve our mission. And so the logic model and the logic model process provided an opportunity for us to do just that. And while some of us might be having flashbacks around previous logic model experiences we've been through in other social movement spaces, for us, we decided to lean into the invitation because we understood that it was going to provide us the discipline and the rigor that we needed as a Spend Out Foundation in order to accomplish our mission and our vision and move in a values-aligned way. And so for us, our logic models are a way for us to connect our internal operations to our theory of change in order to accomplish the external impacts and the outcomes that we want to achieve as a foundation. The process was also useful because it helped us to define our core strategies, our goals, and the activities that we need to achieve them across our 3 different programs and across our operations. So it's really been a great tool for us to weave together the various experiments and work happening within the foundation. And in doing so, it highlighted for us the gaps that existed across our work, where we needed to address those gaps, some of the assumptions that were being made that we needed to spend some time unpacking as a team together. And all of this really helped to ensure that we had shared understanding and shared agreement in how we're moving as an organization. And so we engaged in the process of developing a logic model in part because it was a tool that we could use to evaluate ourselves and hold ourselves accountable from year to year as we make our way to Spend Out. And so as a refresher, the mission of Kataly is to really focus in on how do we redistribute our resources to build the political, the economic, and the cultural power of Black, Indigenous, and all communities of color. And one of the things we sat with as we reached out to our peers in the field, our grantees, when we really tried to hone in on what our theory of change was really understanding that if Kataly is a foundation that's able to resource our organizations and our practitioners and grassroots communities, we can ensure that they have the resources that they need to build power, to build self-determination. And so for us, we're very much committed to ensuring that communities have access to the resources in the ways that they need them in order to be able to build a thriving world that supports not just them, but all of us. And so in order to do this, our vision and our values is a big part of the work that we do as a foundation. If I could get the next slide, please. So we really wanted to set out what is the vision, what is the world that we're trying to create? And we hope to be able to support and do a small piece towards creating a world where Black and Brown people have the resources, the power, and the agency that they need to build visions for justice and well-being. And the values that help to really guide us and support us as a foundation as we work towards this vision is our commitment towards regeneration, ensuring that we're leaving more value in communities than we're taking from them. Interdependence, a recognition that we know that our fate is inextricably linked with that of the grassroots communities that are on the front lines of contesting for power, on the front lines of addressing climate justice change. And so how do we actually move in a way that we understand and recognize that interdependence? Experimentation. Philanthropy can be a field where we want to go towards an era of perfection. We want to say that there's only one right way in moving. We recognize that experimentation for us gives us the freedom to both go towards figuring out how we implement our mission, experimenting with different strategies to get there. And it allows us and gives us permission to adjust and adapt as we go along the way. And so how can we just be one of many experiments in an ecosystem of philanthropic institutions that are really seeking to address systemic change? And then accountability. For us, we don't necessarily want to be a foundation where folks need to feel as though they hold us accountable. We know what we should be doing. And we see accountability as a commitment to the actions that actually align with what we say we want to do in the world. And so how do we continue to be a foundation that is deeply accountable to our mission and therefore deeply accountable to the organizations that we seek to support? And then healing. As we've seen from so many organizations, so many social movements on the ground, our people are hurting. And we know that unfortunately, capital, money, is also a thing that can really impact communities and how they experience themselves. And so healing is an opportunity for us to think about not just the amount of resources that we're moving, but how we move them to our grantees and how we continue to really honor and recognize our ability to support healing and reorient the ways that people engage with philanthropy, with capital, and how they actually want to build a just and more equitable economy. And so all of this really built up towards the strategies that we've started to identify that really grounded our logic model process. And so the strategies that emerge from our various logic models across the organization were these 5 that you see in front of you. First being wealth redistribution. As an organization that was founded as a spend out, we are unequivocally clear that our work is to redistribute our resources out into communities. And so being able to ensure that we are moving capital and resources in a way that helps communities to actually build up the resources and the wealth that they need to thrive. Network development is something that continues to become more clear, particularly through our capacity building program, that our grantees want an opportunity to be in relationship with each other. And so how are we ensuring that as a foundation, we're not just moving resources, but we're also ensuring that our grantees have access to the skills and the networks that are also needed to help them be successful in their work. In philanthropic advocacy, we are clear that part of our tasks and part of what we were told, actually for many of you through our theory of change intake process, was that you wanted us to be out in the field talking to other philanthropic organizations and taking on the advocacy that helps to bring the rest of the field along. And so how do we ensure that the Kataly staff, team members are out talking to other philanthropic institutions, other funders and donors that are really trying to figure out how to continue to advance the ways that they're also trying to be in just and right relationship with grantee organizations. And knowledge production. Knowledge production has been an invitation for us to think about how are we sharing what we're learning, particularly as a practitioner funder. As you heard from many of our staff, Lynn, Jocelyn, Danielle, and others that you'll hear from in the Q&A, we have a team that comes out of a lived and movement experience of doing the work. And so now to have those individuals also engaging in the field of philanthropy, we're learning some things. And so how do we actually share that knowledge with the rest of the field? And then movement infrastructure development. we're really clear that at the end of Kataly's life as a foundation, we want to ensure that we have really helped to build up the scaffolding that supports social movements that are deeply committed to contesting for power and supporting communities on the ground. And so those are the strategies that really have helped to guide us as we've gone through our logic model process. I'm quickly going to highlight just some of the activities to give you a flavor of what we will be working on and have been working on over the past few years. We continue to lean into the invitation to be a trust-based grant-making philanthropic institution. And so learning what does it mean to really lead from those or follow those that are most impacted to really inform our grant-making strategies and decisions. We're also will be really focusing in on building relationships with community-based financial institutions. So some of those Black and Indigenous-led CDs and CDFIs that you heard Lynn speak about, as well as some of the ways that on-the-ground communities, like I think I saw Cooperation Buffalo is on the webinar today. I think I saw some folks from Sea Commons, Real People's Fund, those community-based institutions that are trying to really change the ways we think about investment in capital so that it's regenerative and not extractive. We'll also spend more time doing some cross-program team collaboration. And so how do we, as the Restorative Economies Fund team, our Environmental Justice Resourcing Collective, and the Mindfulness and Healing Justice team come together to figure out where there might be overlap in our grant-making dockets across our grantees? What are we all learning about supporting land-based projects through our different program areas? And so creating more space for that connectivity and shared learning. Some other activities include being able to develop more meaningful relationships with other values-aligned institutions. And so continuing to lean into places where we're in deep relationship with groups like Justice Funders and their Just Transition Integrated Capital Institute, ongoing partnerships with Solidaire, thinking through the other ways that we're able to partner with affinity groups and also be in deep relationship in the funding space. And then also being able to really look at how our grant making program can strengthen and expand movement leadership and infrastructure. And so these are some of the activities that really help to lift up the strategies, and our outcomes are very much about how are we able to support Black, Indigenous, and communities of color in strengthening their self-governance strategies. We want to ensure that people have not just the resources, but the capacity and the vehicles to manage those resources going forward. Also thinking through being able to ensure that we are supporting a field where there's more partnership and deeper connection, that philanthropic institutions start to really shift power and resources to Black, Indigenous, and communities of color, that we're sharing our lessons learned, and then once again, creating holistic, sustainable movement infrastructure. And so this is just a snapshot of our logic model, as there were many across the organization, and Syra did a really excellent job of facilitating each team, of identifying the themes, and really helping us to surface. So what does this mean for all of us as Kataly as a whole? And so in a moment, we're going to kind of head into our Q&A, but wanted to see if I could pass it off to Danielle to really quickly come on and talk about our thinking around data and evaluation as we move into that body of work.
Thank you so much, Anaka. Yes, I would love to just highlight really briefly that as we are working towards the outcomes that were shared, by Anaka and our logic model, we realized the key component of how we realize those outcomes is through having a solid evaluation framework. And we really want to start building an evaluation practice that shows us how we are or maybe are not moving toward alignment with the mission and vision, and where our actions could even better reflect our values internally in the wider field of philanthropy, and very importantly with community of Kataly grantees and partners. And this is an early stage conversation. We are looking forward to building on the scaffolding that has been set for us to begin to do a comprehensive self-evaluation. we're really committed to making it clear that we're not seeking to evaluate grantees. This practice is really about evaluating ourselves and the impact that our decisions and actions have on movement group community and the philanthropic sector. And, I just want to wrap that up by actually sharing an invitation with folks on this call that as we continue to embark on this experiment of redistribution of wealth and really start to look inward and ask sometimes the challenging questions of how we can show up with accountability to mission and to movement, to join us in this conversation. And, we are really excited about this aspect of the work and looking forward to sharing more in the future of what we will be doing. So with that, I am going to hand things off to Zainab to lead us in a session of Q&A.
Thank you so much, Danielle. And I'm going to invite the rest of the Kataly team to come back on camera right now so that we can all see each other while we go through the Q&A portion of the webinar today. Just give us a moment, so we can all be joined. It's just a nice chance for everyone to see everyone's faces instead of being behind the scenes all the time. I think that's almost everyone. I'm just going to turn on video for a couple more folks. All right. So yes, welcome to the Q&A portion of our webinar. Could the folks who haven't spoken during the webinar just take a moment to please introduce yourself and share your role at Kataly?
Good morning, everybody. Great to be here with you. My name is Jolene Ruffin. I'm the Chief Financial Officer at Kataly. I'll pass it on to my colleague, Dana.
Good morning, everyone. Lovely to see you all. My name is Dana Mason, and I am the Operations and Projects Manager here at Kataly. I think Donna's next.
Good morning, everyone. I'm supposed to go next, but my video is locked. Zainab. Oh, there we go. Hi, everyone. I'm Donna Bransford. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Senior Program Officer for the Mindfulness and Healing Justice Program here at Kataly. And I think I'm passing it to Larry.
Greetings and blessings, everyone. My name is Larry Yang. I'm one of the senior advisors to the Mindfulness and Healing Justice Program at Kataly, and I will pass it to Lena.
Hi everyone, my name is Lena. I'm the Executive Assistant to Amaka at Kataly, and I will be passing it to Iris.
Hello all, my name is Iris Garcia. I use she, her pronouns. I am the Program Officer of the Mindfulness and Healing Justice team.
Thanks, team, for the introductions. So we're going to dive into the Q&A, and I know some folks have to leave at the top of the hour, so we will be sharing the recording afterwards. So if you miss the Q&A, you can catch up on a blog post from us. So one thing that we did in our registration is we asked if folks had questions that they wanted to share in advance. So we do have a few pre-submitted questions that we're just going to be answering, and then we'll also turn to some of the questions that were asked during the webinar itself. So the first question that we got was, does Kataly have any plans to actively encourage partnerships among grantees? And so for that, I'm going to turn it over to Jocelyn Wong, who you've heard from, our Director of Capacity Building and Analyst with the REF team.
Love this question. Thank you so much. So, as somebody who spent most of my working life thus far doing development and fundraising, resource mobilization work, this is a fun, geeky question. And I think it's always a fine line, right? When funders play any sort of engagement role that might influence the plans and collaborations of a grantee organization. And so in order to do our best to hold our power with integrity, we always try to ask permission before offering to facilitate introductions among grantees, for example, or making any recommendations that might influence their partnerships and activities. That said, I think something I've appreciated in my transition into philanthropy is that Kataly staff do have a unique vantage point on the movement ecosystems of which we are a part. And with the permission of our grantees, we can help facilitate connections and strengthen networks. I would say that this happens pretty organically within each of the program teams and the relationships they hold with grantees. I'd say that also our capacity building offerings in some instances create containers for deepening relationship and cross learning across grantee organizations. For example, I see some folks from the cohort with our Race for Good boot camp on the call, and this was really an experience for nine groups from MHJ and EJRC that had the opportunity to delve into this really extensive and intensive learning experience together. And peer connection and learning was named by groups as one of the top benefits of participation in that program. So that's another space where we have opportunity for more authentic connection. I'll pause there.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Does anyone else want to jump in or add anything before we move on? All right. So the next question that we received was an ask to hear more about some of the community land ownership work that we do, which Danielle shared a little bit about in her overview of our 2022 grant making. So I'm going to pass it to Donna. Would you like to kick us off with that? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And so I'm just going to speak a little bit about some of the land stewardship projects that we have supported through the Mindfulness and Healing Justice program. And so we've been able to support a small number of Indigenous land rematriation projects and capital projects in the last few years. And for the Mindfulness and Healing Justice team, we're really focused on looking at land liberation, Indigenous rematriation, and stewardship projects that are specifically aimed at creating Black, Indigenous, and people of color led and focused spaces for mindfulness, for collective healing, and transformative practice. And so I'll just name a couple different projects that we funded just to, I think, be able to give people a sense of the work. And so one of them is an organization, the Acorn Center for Restoration and Freedom, which we actually co-funded across all three of the Kataly program areas. So that was a collaborative project that we did together with the other teams. And so Acorn is a Black, queer, and trans-led kind of sanctuary and retreat space in Georgia that is really holding space for kind of arts and cultural-based programming, as well as healing and restoration, really specifically focused on Black, queer, and trans folks. And then a land rematriation effort that we engaged also in supporting, that we co-supported with the Restorative Economies Fund team, is an organization named Kinship Heals, which is led by Aquinnah women, and they were able to rematriate land on their ancestral homeland of Martha's Vineyard. And so with that land, they are really looking to create a space for healing and ceremony and collective care for Indigenous people across the Northeast to be able to use that space really through the use of ancestral lifeways and practices that they are now able to do on their own land. And so that's kind of two projects that we were able to fund through the Mindfulness and Healing Justice team. And I'm happy to, if want to pass that on to anybody else from the team to talk about other land work.
Go ahead, Jocelyn.
Yeah, I can jump in really quickly just on the Restorative Economies Fund. So I'd say one of the most exciting things about the land-based work that we're resourcing is that it really represents a place of intersection across all three program areas of the foundation as a strategy that is core and related to all of our respective programmatic foci. And in this space of the Restorative Economies Fund, the two programmatic focus areas that have the most resourcing to land-based projects are land and housing stabilization, as well as equitable economic development. In the latter, we have a lot of mixed-use commercial enterprises that groups are advancing to build wealth in BIPOC communities. Within the land and housing stabilization area, we see a lot of efforts to move properties, land, and housing as well off the speculative market and into community ownership and governance. And whenever I get bummed out about the world, I really do think about our land-based work and feel like at the end of the day, if we have done nothing else but move a ton of resources to ensure that folks have access to land, the ability to own and steward land, that's something I can hang my hat on. And so I have a lot of pride and gratitude for that area of work.
Thanks, Jocelyn. Anyone else from the team want to offer anything on the land-based work? All right, so moving us along, there's been a few questions I think that have been asked around how Kataly engages with new grantees or how new organizations can connect with us. So Maka is going to just speak to that a little bit, like some of our process and how we connect with new organizations.
Yeah, thanks, Zainab. Yeah, to be honest, I'll say this is a place where we've been challenged as an organization. And this is partly because in leaning into the invitation to do distributed and democratized decision-making across our 3 program areas, it means that we really do trust and look to our practitioner funder program staff to make the grant-making strategies and decisions. And so when we have requests that come in, we always try to do our best to first assess where the grantee might fit based on our current 3 program areas, and then figure out how we might invite the group into a conversation if it's a good fit for our mindfulness and healing justice team or our restorative economies fund. When it comes to the environmental justice resourcing collective, and hopefully we have some of our amazing EGRC leaders are on the webinar with us today, that is a grant docket that has been set by 9 women of color environmental justice leaders. And so it's a closed docket. And when requests come in, we do make it a point to really track and document who those organizations are. So as the EGRC leaders, when the EGRC leaders are considering future funding, whether and how to weave in those organizations into their next round of grant making. And so what we tend to really invite organizations that are interested in connecting with Kataly is take a moment to look at our grantee database. Are there organizations that we're currently funding that you're in relationship with? It might be worth having a conversation with them to understand what their experience is in working with us. And it might be worth seeing if that organization would reach out to us on your behalf. This allows us to be both mindful of the time that grantees put into soliciting and trying to build relationships with new funders, as well as also be mindful of the time that our staff takes and really wanting to be intentional about responding to every request that comes our way. And unfortunately, we can't. And so right now, we are not accepting unsolicited requests for funding. However, should you find your way into one of our inboxes, as many of you do because you're organizers and you guys know how to find us, we'll always do our best to really screen and research your organization and let you know if we think you're a good fit for a follow-up conversation.
Thank you, Amaka. So just moving along, another one of the questions that was resubmitted to us was a question about how are we thinking about loans that will come due in 10 years and how that principal will be managed and by whom going forward. So I'm going to pass this one along to Lynn, our Chief Investment Officer.
Thanks, Zainab. And I just want to give a little bit of background. So I mentioned earlier we were going to talk about the investment strategy for the unrestricted reserve, but we also invest through a restorative economies fund, and that's what this question refers to. So we do 10 years unsecured subordinated debt out of our restorative economies fund. And so that is consistent, and therefore we will make loans that the maturity is after the life of the Kataly Foundation. So this question is pertinent and it's a great question. And right now we are focused on making those loans, and we'll continue to prioritize making loans to community for the foreseeable future. That being said, the honest answer is that we just don't know yet. We don't know who's going to manage them or how they're going to be managed. But what we do know is that This is also part of our wealth redistribution strategy, and we will want to determine in consultation with our borrowers, peers, and partners in the field around what happens to those loans after Kataly is fully spent out. And just to name, we want to remain really open to what emerges and be responsive to the changing dynamics within our field and within our work. I think if the last 3 years has taught any of us anything, it's that planning too far ahead often leads to missed opportunities and unrealistic expectations. So I guess the summary is watch this space.
Thank you, Lynn. Did anyone have anything else to add to that? All right, so turning to some of the questions we've gotten live during the webinar today, there was a question that was sort of specific to the ratio that Danielle shared around our one-time and multi-year support for grantees, which I think kind of speaks to a broader question of how do we sort of make some of these decisions about the type of support that we offer to grantees. So I'm gonna turn it over to Amaka to share some thoughts on that question.
Sure. So we always do our best to provide multi-year general operating support grants to our grantees across our 3 program areas. The times where we might provide a one-time grant, so that 19% that came up in the ratio, that usually speaks to our rapid response grants, our fortification grants, or capital campaign projects where grantees are trying to make or trying to raise funds to acquire a building, to implement a project, or if we have grantees that reach out to us for special one-time needs. But generally our practice is to lean into multi-year grants that grantees can rely on from year to year.
Thank you. So another question that we got was, can we talk more about how we've adapted grant making foci and practices to be more aligned with grantee partner voices? And I'm gonna turn it over to Danielle to share some thoughts on that question.
Yeah, thanks, Zainab. And this is a great question. I think that at Kataly, we have really been striving to figure out how to translate our values of grant making practices that are rooted in relationship and responsiveness to not just the needs, but also the aspirations of grantees into actual parts of the system and the parts of the design. A couple of things that I do want to highlight is really that, our board has decentered itself intentionally to trust the staff and our CEO as funder practitioners, which disrupts the dynamic that I think is often experienced in foundations of program officers having to do case making to move funds forward, especially when they are urgently needed and when they're urgently needed by marginalized communities. And so this is one of the ways that really adapting our grant making to be more aligned with grantee partners and voice is baked into the fabric of how we work. When it comes to grants administration, one of the things that I ask as well as in conversation with our programs teams is how at every turn in the way we design the grant making system can we ensure that our actions are rooted in trust of community. This looks like not having grant applications or really limiting or making brief the forms that grantees need to fill out in order to receive funding. This can look like uplifting oral reporting over written reporting when we're doing annual check-ins with grantees to move payments forward. And one big lesson I think that we've learned and continue to learn is the power of a high touch and strength-based approach when it comes to working with grantees over a hands-off approach. As someone who works in the grants administration space, what I have learned is that over communication of Kataly's position and how we can show up accountably to a community of grantees is better than no communication at all. And this is something that I continue to lean into, and an area where I think we're definitely still exploring and growing or in the into the question of what is possible in our relationship with grantees. So, and I do want to highlight very briefly that my colleague Ure Holgado, who's the Director of Knowledge and Grants, And I wrote a blog post about this earlier in 2022 that Iris will drop in the chat to share a little more technical information about what that has looked like for us.
Thanks so much, Danielle. Loving all of the questions that we're getting. It's great to see all of these coming through. So the next one, just to keep us moving through it, is a two-part question, which is, have we considered investing in BIPOC-led VC firms? And does having more representative management in firms providing equity funding mitigate against concerns with the extractive nature of equity investments in general? So very big question, and I'm gonna turn it to Amaka and Lynn, whoever wants to go first here, to share some thoughts.
I'll start because I know Lynn will do a great job of cleaning it up. So for us, the short answer is no. We are not looking to invest in BIPOC VC firms, either on our investment strategy side of the foundation for our unrestricted assets, or in the restorative economies fund side. This is because both given what Lynn spoke to earlier about really focusing in on supporting Black and Indigenous-led banks, CDs, CDFIs, as well as our work with the Restorative Economies Fund, we are really committed to ensuring that our investment strategies are tied to supporting the material needs of impacted communities on the ground. And so the nature of venture capital focusing in on emerging markets doesn't necessarily align with the goals that we see in wanting to ensure that people, once again, have access to land, food, resources, and housing. The second part of the question about representation in venture capitalist firms, we definitely do think that it goes very far for a financial institution to ensure that they have representative leadership of the communities that they're seeking to invest in. And for us, we're always inviting our financial institute partners to go further, to not just look at representation, but to also look at impact. What is the impact of their investments on the ground? And how is it actually creating more justice, more equity, greater returns for the communities on the ground? So representation is definitely a good place to start. And we always invite people to go a bit further. Lynn?
Thanks, Amaka. I'll just name as well. There's a couple of pieces I took from this question. I think it was aimed at if we would be a limited partner in a fund in particular, which I could see being very attractive because we could push other investors along. But as I mentioned earlier, we have to preserve the capital of the foundation in order to make grants and investments within our limited time horizon, and venture capital doesn't guarantee that that capital will be preserved. It also returns 3 to 5 times an investment, and receiving $2 million and receiving potentially 5 million back seems very extractive still. And there are people that we know. I know a couple of people on this call. In fact, I think representative from Pot Liquor Capital and the Real People's Fund, who are thinking about how to make equity investments within enterprises in our communities in a non-extractive way. That looks like who benefits from the returns that are being, or the profits that are being generated by an organization, and who should get the rights to those profits first. A lot of times enterprises accrue wealth to an individual, and as we have a community wealth and asset building strategy, the general principles of equity don't really fit in line with what we're trying to do at the foundation. That being said, we know that venture capital firms led by Black, Indigenous, and people of color tend to perform better, and they are grossly underfunded. So it's not particularly our sweet spot, but I could see why it would be attractive to people.
Thank you, Amaka and Lynn. Oh, Amaka, did you have something else? Okay. So we've gotten a few questions regarding philanthropic advocacy. So I want to make sure we get a little time for the team to offer some thoughts here. So just some questions like, in our philanthropic advocacy efforts, engaging other foundations and more traditional philanthropic bodies, what is the receptivity to the quote unquote new way in philanthropy, and what has been the most challenging? So I'm sure many folks can weigh in, and I'm going to invite Donna to kick us off here.
Thank you, Zam, and thanks for this question. As I think, these are always interesting questions when someone's putting out there that they're trying to do philanthropic advocacy, which is something that our grantee partners have really asked us to do, right? And so I think we want to just say, like, we're not kind of we're certainly coming with humility, right? That we don't know all the answers, but we're really excited about being in conversation with other funders, talking about how we can be more responsive to our grantee partners, how we can create less burdensome, processes, and how we can really be doing this work of redistributing both resources and power into community. And so I think I've seen, certainly within the kind of mindfulness and healing justice field and other funders doing that work, like a real desire to be in deep conversation around both the how and the what of like how we're doing the grant making, but also what are we supporting. And I think what's the most challenging is, I'm sure probably people have heard this kind of adage, if you've seen one foundation, you've seen one foundation. And I think that often, funders have their own plans, their own things that they're interested in focusing on. And it's not necessarily easy to kind of make shifts in institutions. But that being said, I do feel like in the field, in the moment, there's a real openness to thinking about particularly that how of just how do we do things differently and how are we supporting our grantees. I think both in like how people are being able to support and be sustained in institutions and in organizations and how they're doing the work. And then what's that work that we're trying to support and move. And so I will open that up to anybody else on the team who wants to share kind of experience with philanthropic advocacy conversations.
Anyone else want to add anything there? Any experiences you'd like to share, folks?
I mean, one thing that I'd like to add is that a lot of our grantee partners are incredibly sophisticated and have their own philanthropic funder organizing strategies. And so also what's been exciting, we have a very particular lens of how we do our work, and our grantees are often aligned with that. And so I think we've been allowing ourselves also to flank our partners, to be utilized by our partners, to be placed in conversations or in spaces that are actually advancing both our goals as well as theirs. So I've been really excited about kind of being in that partnership and figuring out how we can flank each other.
I'll speak a little bit to the funder organizing piece from the investments part of the puzzle. So we do get a lot of inquiries from people who are interested in investing with a restorative economics lens. And one of our key goals over the next 3 years is how we co-invest with some other foundations, with some other affinity groups, investment advisors, to ensure that the investees are receiving a broader investor base from which they could raise funds for in the future, as is appropriate, because a lot of people have grant funding alongside that. And we want to, after Kataly's gone, we want people to know how to make restorative economics funds investments from an integrated capital approach. So a lot of that involves really speaking to investment teams and organizing that way. I would say our biggest challenge is oftentimes the program areas and the investment areas aren't talking to each other, and they've just started that work when they brought us in, and they're not really ready to move money yet. And so we spend a lot of time getting really clear about what is your investment strategy going to look like? Who do you need to get on board to buy into that investment strategy? And then when are you going to be ready to invest in the field? So there's justice funders, there's the Just Economy Institute, and there's some other organizations in the field that can really help bring internal investment teams along in what it means to invest with a restorative lens.
Thanks, Lynn. Any other final thoughts on the philanthropic advocacy question? Okay, so I think we have time for just one more question. And one of the questions that came through was whether Kataly has considered engaging in participatory grant-making structures with grantees or partners to increase access to the foundation. So I'm going to turn it over to Amaka for that one.
Sure. This is a great question, and I think this is where our value of experimentation comes in to play. And so there's a few different experiments that we're running as it relates to participatory grant making for Kataly. And before I jump into those experiments, I'll just share we tend to think of participatory grant making as both a vehicle and a strategy for moving more resources out into community, but we also see it as a power building strategy. And so part of what we sit with as a foundation is, does it make sense for us to actually build up vehicles that sit within Kataly as a spend up foundation? Or what does it look like to actually resource those vehicles that are sitting out in communities, where communities have the power, the control, and the access, and the opportunity to experiment with governing, how to govern over resources together with one another. So that being said, as a practitioner funder, once again, our team members who come out of a lived movement experience of doing the work, the experiment that we're running with the Environmental Justice Resourcing Collective, I would say, falls into our most traditional way that people are used to understanding participatory grant making, where we have EJ leaders who come together to set the grant making strategy, the grant making decisions, and then Kataly as a foundation goes through doing the grant funding to those specific organizations. I would say with our Restorative Economies Fund, once again, we do think it helps us to be a better funder, given that our team comes out of doing this work themselves. And we're really focused in on supporting what many would call community governed loan funds. So as Lynn had mentioned, Pot Liquor Capital Fund, you probably heard us talk about Real People's Fund. We want to resource and support those vehicles that communities have already established as the vehicles to move resources into, so that they can determine how those are redistributed. And then similarly with our mindfulness and healing justice team, being able to lean on the brilliance and expertise of Larry, Donna, and Iris to really inform what it looks like to resource the field. So there's a few ways that we're experimenting with it, but one of the things that we have found has really been helpful for us as a foundation is that having a team that has a set of relationships, skills, and connections with the grassroots organizations that we're funding has also allowed us to kind of achieve some of the overall goals that folks may want to have for participatory grant making without having to necessarily centralize everything within a Kataly. So those are some of our experiments around participatory grant making.
Thank you, Amaka. Okay, I'm going to see if we can squeeze in just one last question, and I'm going to make it a capacity building question. So we got a question on what we're learning about the relationship between capacity building and cultivating shared leadership and collaborative teams. So Jocelyn, I'll leave it to you to close this out with the answer to this question. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Great question. I think what it makes me think of is going back to the capacity building design process that we did at the outset. One of the major themes that came up was a desire among grantees to have more support around navigating conflict. I think we all know, unfortunately, too many instances or stories, examples of organizations that have really been torn apart by conflict. And I think when we think about the underlying causes of conflict within movement organizations, right, we know some of the root causes, right? Intense burnout, as a result of the intensity and trauma of the work. Lack of resources or skills for embracing conflict is a necessary part of the work. We do have a lot of conflict aversion that is promoted within our society. And another major one is inequitable organizational structures that do not mirror organizational values. And so we've seen a lot of examples of organizations really experimenting with and trying on for size different types of organizational structures and leadership models, right? From co-directorships to more flat organizational structures as opposed to hierarchical structures. And folks are learning, right? Learning as we go. This is a relatively new trend or pattern that we're seeing in the field. And so one of the ways that we've engaged this piece is, first of all, around providing some resources around navigating conflict. We did a great workshop series with People's Hub around their Living into Conflict offering. And then also connecting grantees around leadership models, and where there's permission, interest, facilitating some of those connections that allow for folks to share about what leadership models they're trying to emphasize, what they're learning about, having more deeply democratic community governance structures. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Jocelyn. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us and sticking with us right till the end. Just really appreciate the energy that folks brought to the webinar and all of these really great, wonderful questions that we received. We tried our best to answer as many of them as we could. And for the questions that we weren't able to get to, we'll definitely be incorporating answers to those in upcoming content from the foundation and future webinars. So please stay tuned. You can always stay connected with us via our email list is one of the best ways. So you can sign up for our email list via the website, which is www.kataly.org. And then we're also on LinkedIn and Twitter. So we hope that folks will stay connected with us. And thank you again so much for joining us today. And yeah, more soon from all of us. Thank you.